You're tuned in to the deep dive. We're jumping straight into something pretty significant today, especially if you're keeping tabs on international relations, maybe with an eye on your UPSC exams.
Absolutely.
Just last week, the Financial Times reported that China's Coast Guard has declared sovereignty over Sandy Cay, right there in the South China Sea.
A direct claim, yes, in very contested waters.
Exactly. So let's unpack this. Why does this specific move matter for understanding, the bigger picture in Asia?
Well, the South China Sea, it's more than just islands, right? It's a vital global trade route, huge strategic importance, and it's a real flashpoint for competing claims.
Always simmering.
Always. And the Sandy Cay development, it might seem small, but the FT analysis suggests it's a really telling piece of a much larger strategy.
Okay.
So our mission today really is to look past the headlines, get into the who, what, where, and crucially, the why. Why Sandy Cay? Why now? And what does it tell you as someone tracking this stuff closely, perhaps for your exams?
Okay, so the Financial Times uses this phrase, fine slicing annexation. Sounds quite deliberate. Can you explain that, the salami slicing idea?
Yeah, it's a very apt term. Salami slicing, basically it's about making small incremental gains, little steps. None of the steps on their own are big enough to trigger, say, a massive international crisis or unified military response.
But they add up.
Exactly. Over time, the cumulative effect is huge. It fundamentally shifts the situation on the ground, or, well, on the water in this case, almost without anyone noticing until it's done.
Like taking slices off a salami until it's gone, essentially.
Precisely. And Sandy Cay, described as this modest, uninhabited sliver of land, it fits that pattern perfectly. It's not a big, dramatic grab.
Right.
It's persistent, step-by-step assertion of control. And, the FT reminds us, this isn't brand new tension around Sandy Cay. There were reports back in 2015, 2017.
So nearly 10 years of back and forth on this specific spot.
That's right. This gradual approach, it's really key to understanding China's long game here.
Okay, help us visualize this. Where exactly is Sandy Cay, and why is its location so important geopolitically?
Geographically, it's in the Spratly Islands. And its importance really comes down to proximity.
Okay.
It's very close to two key features. First, Subi Reef. That's where China's built one of its huge artificial islands, with the airstrip, the port, a major military outpost.
A big power projection base.
Definitely. And second, it's also near Thitu Island, which the Philippines occupies. Pagasa Island, as they call it.
So Sandy Cay sits right in the middle of this contested zone.
Smack bang in the middle. So even though it's just a modest, uninhabited sliver, any change in who controls it or claims it sends ripples through the whole region.
Now, the FT also mentioned something, well, ironic, a potential legal argument China might be using. Something about Sandy Cay helping its claim over Subi Reef.
Yes, this is a fascinating potential aspect of their strategy. The FT points out this possible legal rationale. See, Subi Reef, in its natural state, it's what's called a low tide elevation.
Meaning it's underwater at high tide.
Exactly. And under UNSLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, you generally can't claim territorial waters or an exclusive economic zone, an EEZ, around a feature that's submerged at high tide.
Okay, makes sense.
But the theory goes if China can assert sovereignty over nearby Sandy Cay, which is a naturally formed feature, above water, then maybe they can argue that Sandy Cay generates those maritime zones, and those zones just happen to extend over and encompass the now heavily built-up Subi Reef.
Ah, so using the tiny natural island to legitimize the massive artificial one, legally speaking.
Potentially. That seems to be the thinking explored in the report, and the irony, as the FT highlights, is pretty stark.
Because China hasn't exactly been a strict follower of UNSLOS verdicts before. Thinking of the 2016 arbitral ruling.
Precisely. They've often appeared to disregard international law, especially UNSLOS, when it conflicts with their 9-line claims. So this apparent newfound interest in using a feature like Sandy Cay for a UNSLOS-based justification around Subi, well, it's definitely noteworthy, maybe a bit contradictory.
Interesting. What about the timing? The FT notes that China often makes these moves when the world is looking elsewhere. Any specific distractions now?
That's a really sharp observation, and yes, the FT does point that out. It says, seasoned watchers aren't surprised to see China act at a time of international distraction.
Right.
Now, the report doesn't explicitly name one current global crisis as the distraction, but the general principle holds true, looking back historically.
Okay.
China often seems to time these assertive actions strategically. Perhaps calculating it minimizes the chance of coordinated international pushback. It's a pattern worth keeping in mind as you analyze these events.
Okay. Now turning to the reaction. The report mentioned a prompt counter-assertion by the Philippines, using armed forces, law enforcement. That sounds quite robust.
It does, and the FT really emphasizes this quick response from Manila as maybe a key difference this time around.
How so?
Well, on April 27th, apparently, the Philippines carried out an operation specifically to reassert sovereignty, not just at Sandy Cay, but two other small features as well. It signals a clear resolve under the current Marcos administration. They're showing they won't just let these incremental encroachments happen without pushing back.
They're not just filing diplomatic protests.
Seems like it. They're making a physical statement. And importantly, the FT notes this operation didn't seem to have direct U.S. military backup.
Suggesting Manila acted on its own initiative here.
Yeah, it appears to be the implication. A unilateral assertion of their claims, which is also significant.
But despite this Filipino pushback, the Financial Times still expects, quote, limited punishment for China. Why? Why wouldn't this stronger response lead to more consequences for Beijing?
It's about the wider regional chessboard, according to the FT's analysis. While things are obviously tense between Manila and Beijing because of all this maritime coercion,
Yeah.
China's been busy strengthening its ties with many other Southeast Asian countries, diplomatically, economically.
Playing the long game regionally.
Exactly. So that could make it harder to get a really strong, unified condemnation out of ASEAN, the regional bloc. Other members might be hesitant, worried about upsetting their own relationship with Beijing.
Which brings us to ASEAN. The report suggests they're unlikely to make much of a fuss. Why so muted?
The FT reckons it's down to a couple of things. First, there's the existing diplomatic framework. You've got the 2002 Declaration on Conduct, the DOC, and the ongoing, very slow negotiations for a binding code of conduct, the COC.
Right. Those talks have been going on forever.
They have. And a big public spat over Sandy Cay could be seen as undermining that whole process, which ASEAN states and China are, at least publicly, committed to.
And the second reason?
Probably a pragmatic calculation. The thinking might be, look, as long as China doesn't actually start building anything significant on Sandy Cay, maybe it's better just keep things low-key, avoid a major diplomatic blow-up. It's a cautious approach, reflecting how ASEAN members have different stakes and sensitivities when it comes to China.
Okay, what about the big player, the United States? They talk a lot about the Indo-Pacific. They have a treaty alliance with the Philippines. What does the FT see the U.S. doing here?
This is a really critical point the FT raises, touching on the effectiveness of U.S. policy. Despite all the talk about competing with China, alliance solidarity, joint military exercises happening recently.
Like the Balikatan exercises.
Exactly. Despite all that, the FT suggests the U.S. is similarly unlikely to take a stand over the status of such a small, unoccupied feature.
Really? Even with their ally being directly challenged?
That seems to be the assessment. The report mentions those drills between U.S. Marines and Filipino forces up in northern Luzon, but specifically notes there wasn't any obvious U.S. military support for that Philippine operation at Sandy Cay itself. So this seeming reluctance to get directly involved in these specific small-scale incidents, well, it raises questions about the real-world limits of U.S. commitments when faced with China's step-by-step tactics.
And the FT also thinks that China might actually want this outcome, to show the U.S. isn't fully backing its ally.
That's the potential strategic angle, yes. By making these moves and seeing a, perhaps, limited U.S. response, Beijing can try to paint the U.S. as maybe not quite the reliable security partner it claims to be, at least not when push comes to shove over these smaller features. It plays into China's narrative about its rising influence and perhaps declining U.S. clout in the region.
Undermining U.S. credibility.
Potentially. It's a subtle but important part of the power play happening there.
The Financial Times doesn't just point fingers at the U.S., though. It calls the lack of pushback a collective and cumulative failure of much of the international community. That's pretty strong language.
It is a strong indictment. The report argues it's not just Washington. It's a broader failure by nations that say they care about international law, about sovereignty. They haven't done enough, consistently enough, to deter China.
Anyone specific mentioned?
They specifically call out Australia, for example, suggesting Canberra should be more vocal in opposing China's provocative and destabilizing actions and its baseless claims over places like Sandy Cay. It really highlights how hard it is to build and sustain a truly united international front against this kind of incrementalism.
So the core message seems to be China's advance in the South China Sea just keeps rolling forward. The FT says it only rolls forward, never back. They mentioned Scarborough Shoal in 2015 as maybe a brief pause.
Exactly. Scarborough Shoal was interesting because there was a standoff, a period where things were checked, albeit temporarily. It showed that sometimes Beijing can be paused.
But it didn't last.
No. The overall trend, as the FT stresses, is relentless forward movement. China seems to have learned that by picking its moments, acting incrementally, it can usually manage the fallout and avoid a truly decisive international response.
The report even floats a what if. What if there had been a big international response back in 2013 when the large-scale island building really kicked off? Might things be different?
Yeah, it touches on that counterfactual, acknowledging its speculation, of course, but the FT suggests a stronger, more unified pushback. Then, well, maybe it could have altered the path we're on now.
But that ship has sailed.
Pretty much. And the report is quite pragmatic. It doubts the international reaction to Sandy Cay in 2025 will be fundamentally different from what we saw around Scarborough Shoal in 2012, or even going further back, Johnson Reef in '88, the Paracels in '74. History suggests a pattern here.
But, and this seems important, the FT does stress the difference this time is the Philippines' own actions, their prompt counter-assertion. Why is that highlighted?
Because amidst this rather bleak pattern, that is a significant new variable. Manila's quick public response shows, according to the FT, much better maritime policy coordination under President Marcos Jr.
A change from the previous administration.
A definite shift. It shows a clear resolve to resist further Chinese encroachment. They're actively defending their claims, even against a much bigger neighbor. That willingness, that resolve, is newsworthy. And the FT says it deserves tangible support from Manila's allies and partners.
So the Philippines is stepping up, even if the wider response is muted.
That seems to be the key dynamic highlighted in this specific incident.
The report also makes an interesting point about the geography itself. These sparsely populated scraps of coral and sand, how do they actually help China's strategy?
It's almost counterintuitive, isn't it? But the very nature of these small, often uninhabited or barely inhabited features makes them ideal targets for salami slicing.
How so?
Because taking control of one tiny reef or shoal doesn't, in isolation, seem like a huge deal. It doesn't immediately threaten major population centers or critical economic assets in the same way, say, seizing a major port would.
So it doesn't trigger the same level of alarm bells internationally.
Right. It allows China to change the facts on the water, bit by bit, without necessarily crossing a threshold that demands a massive unified response. Each slice is small, but eventually they control more and more strategic space. It's like death by 1,000 cuts for the status quo.
Finally, the FT makes a comparison to Taiwan. It notes China uses pressure tactics against Taiwan's territories in the South China Sea too, like Pratas Reef or Itu Aba. But annexing Taiwan itself is a whole different ballgame.
Yes, they use this great analogy. The South China Sea moves are like thinly cut hors d'oeuvres, while trying to take Taiwan would be like consuming the sausage whole.
Huh. Okay. Explains the difference in scale.
Exactly. The point is, while the incremental moves in the South China Sea are deeply concerning and change the strategic map over time, a move on Taiwan would be a fundamentally different category of action. Massive, immediate geopolitical shockwaves, likely triggering a far more severe international crisis. The risks for Beijing would be exponentially higher. Got it. So let's try and wrap this up. What's the absolute core takeaway from this Financial Times analysis of the Sandy Cay situation?
I think the main point is, this isn't random. China declaring sovereignty over Sandy Cay is just the latest move in a very deliberate, long-term strategy of gradual expansion in the South China Sea.
Salami slicing in action.
Precisely. They exploit opportunities, they test boundaries, and while the Philippines is showing more backbone now, the broader international pushback remains, well, limited and often ineffective. Recognizing this consistent pattern is crucial.
And for you listening in maybe deep in UPSC preparation, why is tracking this specific development so important?
Because understanding these South China Sea dynamics, China's strategy, the responses from the Philippines, from ASEAN, the role of the U.S., it gives you vital context for India's own strategic neighborhood.
Right.
This touches on international law, maritime security, power shifts in Asia, all absolutely core topics for your prelims and mains prep. You need to grasp these complexities. Okay, that leads perfectly into a final thought for you to mull over. Given this pattern, the FT lays out China's incrementalism, the limited effective response, what could work long-term. What strategies might nations like the Philippines or others who want to uphold international law actually pursue in the South China Sea?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? There
Right.
are no easy answers. It likely needs a mix of diplomacy, strengthening regional partnerships, maybe economic levers, enhancing maritime capabilities.
The complex challenge demanding creative thinking. Definitely something for you to consider further.
Absolutely.
We really encourage you to dig into this. As we said, our main source today was the excellent reporting in the Financial Times. Do check out their work. And if this deep dive helped you connect the dots on this vital issue, please do like, subscribe, and maybe drop a comment with your own thoughts or questions.
Yeah, we appreciate you tuning in and engaging with these critical global developments.